Hi, my name's James from Off to Class, and in this TOEFL webinar I'll be giving you a step-by-step guide to teaching TOEFL lessons to your students, and this will be of particular interest for those of you who have never taken TOEFL students previously or who have very little knowledge of the test itself. So what I'm going to cover today will be firstly what to do when a new student comes to you for TOEFL lessons. What's your starting point? We'll look at determining the student's current strengths and weaknesses through grammar, listening, reading, speaking, and writing. It's a good idea to look at all of these competencies. I'll then take you through the structure of the test, the idea of developing a learning plan for that particular student, the idea also about using graded texts on subject matters and the academic disciplines that you will find in the TOEFL test, and then thinking about using manageable chunks of information. Some of the texts and the listening passages are quite long in TOEFL, and that's not really appropriate for you in a lesson where you want to be keeping the motivation quite high for both you and the student. You'll want to think about reducing the amount of information that's given in a particular task. So when taking on new students, I guess you need to find out what can I do for that student, and as well as letting the student tell you what you want to do is actually find that out as well. You're going to need to do some kind of diagnostic test. So when talking about the desired outcome for TOEFL students, it's normally in most cases the desire to get into a higher education institution in North America. It's accepted everywhere, TOEFL, in the United States, or just about, and I think in other countries as well. It's certainly one of the world's most popular standardized tests. So find out why the student is taking this test. Find out if it's the student's motivation that's primarily behind the decision, or if there are parents as well who are involved. So there's also that aspect that has to be taken into, because you need to manage any student's expectations that you take on. If you can, find out when and where they will sit the test, and if they don't know yet, that probably gives you an indication that they're not quite ready to be thinking about TOEFL. You want a TOEFL student to kind of have set themselves an end date that keeps motivation high, and it also means that the student is going to be very committed to you. If they come to you with a test date of X, then you can work X minus back and find out exactly how you're going to work out that lesson plan, commit to a schedule, and off you go. Why are they taking the test? I just talked about. Find out what the student's personal interests are. Although TOEFL deals primarily across a wide range of academic disciplines, if you can meld the student's personal interests into some of the texts or exercises, that's always a really good thing to do. But at the same time, if you come across students who have very little interest in current affairs in the world and almost no interest in, say, the discipline of science, you might want to start ramping up their exposure, especially in reading and listening, because science in particular is a discipline that comes back time and time again in the TOEFL reading, and particularly in reading and listening. Find out, of course, if the student already has experience with TOEFL. There's nothing worse than having a student in front of you who knows more about the test they're about to sit than you do. And this is one of the reasons that we have produced a number of webinars. We've got a webinar that I'm going to show you that we've done for each section. So we have about a 40-minute long webinar on the writing section alone, the reading section, the speaking, and the listening section alone, that goes through each of the question types that you're going to come to as a teacher. And you want to be cognizant of all of that before you take on a new student. And next, we're going to go and talk about the student's current level. You need to find a starting point, and the starting point that the student gives you shouldn't necessarily be the one that you take for granted. They might tell you that they're an intermediate. That's a relative term that means almost nothing in today's educational world. What you need to find out is, okay, you're at this level, but where are your strengths and where are your weaknesses? Where's your starting point? So I'm going to quickly take you to our website now. This is Off to Class, and we have here, for example, a placement test. So a placement test is a great starting point because it doesn't just spit out a level at the end of the test, it also gives you a gap analysis. You can assign the test quite easily here. You can assign a compulsory grammar diagnostic followed by a listening, reading, writing, and speaking activity if you wish. And once the student has completed that, it will return these results to you. So we've got a graphical representation at the top that you can see. On the right hand side is the Council of Europe framework reference for European languages level. So this student has come out at a B2. There's even a little warning note here that the results that the student has produced might not be consistent throughout the different levels, and you need to take special note of that. But interestingly, or most interesting for a teacher, is what comes underneath. So the student says he's a B2. What does that really mean? The student is a B2 who still has managed to answer a number of questions incorrectly at the A1 and A2 level. And as we go down, for example, you can see here that the student has still had a few problems, for example, in a B2 question here about conditionals. So what you can do, you can see the question, the student's answer, the correct answer, and best of all, we supply you with some lesson material here. And just by clicking on that link, that will take you immediately to the lesson. I'm not going to bother to enroll the student, but you can see a lesson comes up that deals with this point in particular. So very simply, once you have the level and the student comes back with these supposed weaknesses, you can address them. Find out whether that was just a weakness in the moment of the test, the student misread the question or just rushed through it, or whether there actually is an issue with conditionals. And at a TOEFL level student, I would be concerned if they did have conditional problems with the first conditional, for example. So you could go through and make a nice lesson out of this. And going back to the results, you can see that that runs the whole way through. So you could go through and test those. You could also mix them in with the TOEFL lessons themselves. And just to go back to our lesson library, if you scroll down, you can see already that there are a whole lot of categories here. We've got a lot of grammar activities. We've also got lessons for IELTS, but here for speaking, for each one of the skills, speaking, listening, writing, and reading, going from left to right on the site, there's a drop-down list. And if I go to TOEFL speaking, there's a nice introductory lesson at the beginning, and then I would follow with a lesson that is dedicated to each question type, and that repeats itself in each category. So in the listening section, there are far more question types. I've actually got a couple of introductory lessons to the listening section because it's a little more of a complicated section, and then again dedicated lesson. The same in the writing, and finally in the reading section you've got one introduction lesson followed by another 10 lessons that are dedicated each solely to a single question type in the exam. So that's a good starting point for you. I'll come back now to talking about the student's current level. Once you've got the student's level, once you've got these gaps or weaknesses in the student's grammatical and language abilities, and once you know that there are 35 lessons on our site that will teach all the structure and format and skills required, you can then work backwards from the date. So take the student's date and go backwards and say, I've got 35 lessons. I want to fit in another 16 general English language lessons. You've got 6 weeks. I can't do the maths, but let's say 4 lessons a week for the next whatever weeks will take you through, that's not going to work out, but that will take you through to the end date. And you can get a great level of commitment by showing that you've got these lessons ready to go. This is the sequence, this is the order in which they're going to run. And at the same time as teaching you TOEFL, I'm going to have 15% of your time that's going to be spent getting particular skills up to scratch with general English language. Be wary of taking on a student whose proficiency level is less than B2. If you're doing this, you either need to make sure that you manage the student's expectations or that you dedicate a far larger amount of time to teaching the general English. So if I took a student who was at B1, and I probably wouldn't, what you would want to do is make sure you've got those 35 lessons on our site, and then on top of that, you're giving perhaps another 50 to 60 lessons in general English. And you really need to be responsible and honest as a TOEFL teacher. This is a test that costs a lot of money. There's a lot riding on it for students who sit standardized tests, who are going for something as important as entrance into a higher education institution. So it's professional and it's on you as the teacher to manage the students' expectations, and don't make them believe that you can deliver something that you can't in a limited space of time. It's better to reject a student who comes to you 3 weeks before the exam not knowing anything about the test, than being honest with them and saying, do the test at another time, put the test date forward 6 months. You have to be realistic about what you can help the student with. And as I mentioned, general English lessons should form a part of the student's overall curriculum with you, but outside the scope of TOEFL. Don't get them mixed up in the same lesson itself. So going on now to the structure, I'll go through this quite quickly. The reading section is the first section on the test. It will last between 60 and 100 minutes. The difference here is because ETS, the company that administers the TOEFL test, often puts sample questions in. So this will be the difference between 3 and 5 texts. If the student encounters 5 texts, and they won't know this until they start the test, 2 of those will actually not be scored, but are used for sampling purposes or testing purposes by ETS. The student should respond to every question as though it's going to be scored, because it is not necessarily the first 3 sets of questions on the first 3 texts that will count towards the score, and then the 2 following will be for testing purposes by ETS. That's not how it works. So they need to approach every question as though that question was going to form part of their final score. The text length is approximately 700 words in length. I think I mentioned that before, so about 4 to 5 paragraphs. Far too large, in my opinion, to be undertaking in one lesson by itself. That's not to say that students can't read more than 700 lessons. In fact, you should be able to read far more than 700 words in a 50-minute lesson, but don't focus on the same text all the time. The student shouldn't be reliving a practice TOEFL test with you. They've come to you to find out strategies and the format of the test and strategies for answering the questions, not just to do the test over and over again, and certainly tests that will not be the same material as what they're finding. You need to teach the strategy. So 700 words is great, but cut it down to smaller chunks, which is what we've done in our lessons on the site. Generally 12 to 14 questions per text. There are 10 different questions in the reading section, and some of these will appear on multiple occasions, particularly vocabulary and the detail questions. So the last thing to mention about reading, students can actually return to questions that they haven't had time to answer or weren't able to answer, and this is unlike the other sections on the test. So you can skip a question, skip another question, and come to the end and find a table that says you still have 2 of 10 questions, 2 of 12 questions to answer, and you can return, time permitting, go back and guess or spend more time answering those questions. And the final thing to note in the reading section is that the text is visible to the student the entire time throughout the reading section, throughout that particular set of questions. So going on to listening now. Listening appears second on the test. Again, the same thing. ETS puts sample questions in here sometimes, so the student will either need 60 or 90 minutes and will either answer 6 or 9 recordings. So again, they won't know which ones are applicable to the final score. They need to approach every question as though it appears on theirs. The recordings are between 3 and 7 minutes in length, so I cannot emphasize enough the importance of taking notes, because unlike the reading section of the TOEFL test, the student will hear the listening passage once only, and after that's done, the questions come one by one. You cannot return to previous questions, and you certainly cannot hear the listening passage again. There are 3 types of recordings. One is an academic lecture, and so in the academic lectures, the students will listen primarily to a professor talking, maybe with 1 or 2 students answering questions or having a small discussion in between. Office hours conversations, which are the kind of conversations that you would have with your professor if you went to discuss something that needed clarification from a previous lecture, or that you needed to talk about extending your assignment hand-in date. And finally, you've got service countering conversations, which are between a student and an employee on campus. And these are the kinds of conversations that the student would hear, or would engage in rather. So it might be something to do with the library borrowing rules, or finding new accommodation on campus, something to do with non-academic life on the campus itself. So the student has 20 minutes to answer the questions. There are only 6 or 5 questions. They are quite challenging, especially the function questions. So ensure that your student, every time that you do a listening activity, is taking extensive notes. And one thing that I've provided for in the lessons that we've put on our site is that once the student has taken notes, you should, before proceeding to answer any questions, what can the student actually recall from their notes? Are the notes sufficient enough for the student to be able to give back to you a summary of what they heard? And that's a really important thing. Too many of us take notes just because it becomes habitual action. We're not even really paying attention to it, and we don't even know what we're listening for. So note taking is a particular skill that you should try and improve for students. Not everybody has great listening, note-taking skills, but some do. Okay, speaking at a glance, that comes straight after reading and listening. It's a short section, 20 minutes. There are 6 questions in it. So the only thing I'm going to highlight here is most people feel a little bit anxious about speaking under pressure. And obviously, it's not something you can stop and start against. Once the clock starts, you have 45 or 60 seconds to deliver your response. You have a very short preparation time of between 15 and 30 seconds. It flies by. So the 2 things I want to address here is that when you're teaching speaking, and this is one thing that's great about Alison's on the site, is there are 2 different types of tasks. So one is the 2 questions are independent questions. That means that a question prompt appears, and without any further input, the student must formulate, prepare a response, and then deliver that response. The interesting ones are the integrated questions. They're the 4 of the questions on the test are integrated, and so these are combined. And what I mean by that is that a student will first encounter a reading text, followed by a listening passage. They need to take notes, synthesize that information, a prompt will come out, and then they must speak about the information from both of those texts. They probably need to compare it or show a point of view of one towards another. So it's really important here, if you're teaching speaking, not to just take a speaking topic and talk about it and see how fluently the student and confidently the student can answer or speak about a particular topic. You're looking at a very particular set of skills there. How does the student listen and then respond with appropriate information? Okay, and finally, always the lucky last on any standardized test is the writing section. So it's the last section, 60 minutes to complete it. There are 2 tasks. Like I mentioned in the speaking, the first question is an integrated task. Again, there's a longer listening passage, a reading text of approximately 300 or 400 words. The student needs to synthesize that. There will be a prompt, and the student will need to respond by making reference to both pieces of info, both the listening passage and the reading text. It's not as simple as it appears. However, if you enforce good note-taking again through both reading, listening, and writing, it does make the task easier for the student. And in particular, linking and transition words. So the second question is the independent task. This is the one that many students struggle on because they often feel that they don't have a particular opinion on anything. One thing that I've highlighted in the lessons on our site that deal with the independent task is nobody really cares about your opinion, so just make it up. And this is something you must put into students who do not feel confident or think they don't have an opinion on anything. The examiner is looking for a formula. Of course, it's easier for students who have an opinion on a particular prompt that's given to them, but just invent it, make it up. No examiner is going to check the veracity or the truthfulness of anything you have written. So don't write anything outrageous, but make sure you are following the formula and you can get through it reasonably easy. The last thing I mentioned about writing is that you need to type your response via a keyboard. in the TOEFL IBT. And just be aware, as I had forgotten myself, when you go to sit it, you may not be particularly comfortable with the type of keyboard that you were given. It's a minor point, but I found my keyboard slightly annoying. It was old and clunky compared to the one on my modern laptop. So if you can recreate that part of the environment, give it a go. Get them to write on different keyboards if that's something that's possible for you. Okay, so the learning plan and topics. Once you know the student's needs, the skills and the test date, as I said, you can go backwards and work out what the student's needs are. Now, when you get the results back from our lesson plan, you're probably going to see, as in many cases, that students' grammar is a lot stronger for some of them than their other production skills. In particular, students often overstate their speaking and listening skills, and that's because we're often dealing with the same classmates, we're often dealing with the same teacher, and so we get very used to talking about the things that just become familiar to us, that we're all comfortable about. But this TOEFL test will obviously push people out of their comfort zone. So when students say, oh, I don't need speaking and I don't need listening, just reading and writing, you're the expert, you're the teacher. You make sure that according to the learning plan and the lessons on our site, that's really what's required. A lot of students, I think, probably lose points in speaking simply because they feel quite comfortable doing it. It's the easiest part of the skill set of the English language for them. One comment I would like to make is that the environment, topics around the environment appear quite frequently in the test. Probably it's a sign of the times. But science and the environment in particular feature quite heavily. So while there are a wide range of academic disciplines that will appear in the listening and reading in particular, it's a really good idea to get students a little bit up to speed with climate change and, I don't know, ocean biology and things like this. Things that are really stuff that's happening around today with our changing planet. They don't appear in every test, but it's just an area that I would particularly do if you have students who are, for example, a little bit averse to science in particular. Okay, and finally, I want to talk about using graded text and come back to an appropriate length. So it's worth pointing out, I believe, that standardized tests, we often talk about authentic language, and you'll see a lot of resources and websites that are English as a second language websites will say authentic language. I'm not the biggest, first of all, it's just untrue. There's no such thing on these websites as authentic English. My authentic English is coming to you now, but it's full of mistakes and hesitations, and I take time to come out with things, and that's authentic English. These texts do not do that, and neither do most ESL texts. So everything that appears in TOEFL is graded, and it is graded, it's very good English for a start, and it's graded for a specific purpose. A, so that they can ask a question type based on that text, but B, they write the texts in a way that the student can follow, and everything is explained in a logical and coherent manner. They are not going to get authentic English in the sense that somebody could be babbling in an incoherent way. That is authentic English. So be aware when you are getting students to go outside the classroom and listen to different English, not all English is good English. And be very aware of pushing them to things like talkback radio, where people can just be literally talking nonsense. You want to be going onto sites with some kind of graded English, and not every news current affair website is appropriate. Also, in the reading section in particular, these texts are written, as I mentioned before, in an organizational style. So the author may be using a compare and contrast organizational style, or problems and solutions, theory and support. You really want to be finding texts and listening passages that provide this information in an introduction, followed by solution number 1, solution number 2, solution number 3, and a very small conclusion. This is the format of all of the reading texts in particular. Listening is very much the same, so it's authentic in quotes, but it's primarily very good graded language. Khan Academy, K-A-H-N, is a great website for students to get a foothold in different topics. There are lots of videos on there that have a transcription anywhere between about 5 and 10 minutes in length, and I highly recommend those. And obviously on our website we have a lot of graded texts as well that are written in the appropriate style. The final thing I want to mention is TOEFL. Students always, a lot of TOEFL students will have a lot of other things going on in their life. So they might be finishing high school, they have a part-time job, they have other commitments like most of us, and they won't be dedicating all of their time to the TOEFL test. You've got to keep the students interested in the lessons, and if you're 3 to 6 months out of the test, that can be quite challenging. So as I mentioned before, having a very definite lesson plan that is committed to by the student, that they know next week they're going to be doing passage summary questions in the listening exam, followed by the following Thursday they'll be doing the text insertion, table completion questions in the listening exam. This gives them a very thorough and shows that you're very professional. You break it down into manageable components, and that goes for the same within the lesson itself. Make sure that you're not doing a 700-word text or a 7-minute listening activity at the same time. As the teacher, you don't want to remain passive. So in a 50-minute lesson, the lessons on our website are broken down into about 15 different slides with 5 to 7, 8 tasks in each one, and some of those will require skim reading rather than a close reading, or there'll be a very short 1.5-minute listening exercise just for the introduction rather than 7 minutes. And that allows students to slowly build up the skills and put in place the strategy that you've shown them to answer each of the questions in the TOEFL test. So thanks for your time. I hope it was of some benefit for you. If you wish, you can leave a comment here. You're welcome to get in contact if you have any questions. So I'm James from Off to Class, and thanks again.